Hello, everyone. Welcome. We're here today to talk about applying harm reduction when working with the LGBTQ plus population. We have two very special guests. My name is Carrie Leonard. I'm the Director of Learning. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'll let my fabulous guests introduce themselves.
My name is Michelle. I am one of the program managers with ODR at the Nest. I've been at the People Concern for a little over a year now, and I actually created the LGBTQ plus training that we're using right now to help folks learn how to work with the community.
My name is Christian. I'm a clinical case manager with ODR at the Nest. My pronouns are he, him, his.
All right, thanks. So I will be today's moderator. I will be asking our guests some questions. And the first question is, what does LGBTQ plus mean?
Yeah, so that's kind of, it's hard for people because there's so many letters in the whole acronym, and people are kind of like, oh, like what's this alphabet soup? Like what does every single letter mean? And even within the community, there's some letters that are kind of contested. So it's really important to kind of keep up with what the acronym is and like what things are appropriate to include in there and not. So, I mean, I think most people know the main ones: L for lesbian, G for gay, B for bisexual, T for transgender, and then Q is one of the ones that people have historically used for questioning, but also people are using for queer. So queer is kind of like an umbrella term to include basically meaning like not cisgender and not heterosexual. Cisgender is also a term that a lot of people aren't super familiar with. So cisgender just basically means that you identify with the gender that you were assigned at birth. So I was identified female at birth, and I identify that way, so I'm a cisgender woman. Someone who is transgender would have been assigned opposite gender, or maybe they're even agender or genderqueer, and so they don't really identify with either gender, or maybe they identify with both. So either way, some of those folks also will identify as transgender. So
and the plus?
And the plus, there's a lot of the plus, right? So there's a lot of ones that are like more popular, and then there are some that are like gaining popularity and folks are starting to use. So it's definitely not going to be an exhaustive list that I'm going to give right now, but I think some of the more popular ones that people are using right now is like pansexual, which is very similar to bisexual, but kind of pan meaning all encompassing. So folks who maybe are attracted to men or women, or people who identify as either a man or a woman, someone who's agender, or people who are transgender men and women. So, but there are a lot of bisexual folks who will say that sexuality includes all of that as well. So that one's kind of a little bit contested, some people with bisexual and pansexual, but just have those conversations with your client and see what that means for them, because everybody has their own ways of identifying themselves. Another one is like demisexual, and that is somebody who doesn't really feel sexual attraction to somebody until there's a romantic attraction put into place. That one's one that a lot of people are starting to use right now. And then asexual is something else that people will use, and that's just kind of someone maybe who has no real like concern about having sexual relationships with folks. And then there's also aromantic, which is kind of the other one where people don't really care to have romantic relationships with other folks. And agender and asexual is on a spectrum, right? It's not always going to be zero. Like there's going to be some people who are like, wow, I met this 1 in a million person, and like they're the person for me. But again, conversations to have with your client, right? Like the community is so large and so varied that you really have to be able to just kind of take everybody as they come.
Thanks, Michelle. That was really helpful. So yeah, let's get into working with our clients. So what are some things that staff should take into consideration when working with clients who identify as LGBTQ plus?
Right. And just to piggyback off what Michelle was saying, I think it's important to mention that, yes, we do have these labels to recognize the different identities within the spectrum. But again, it's so important to not put clients in boxes or have assumptions, because For instance, even if people share a common queer identity, not all of our clients are going to look the same or have the same interests. And so just being able to talk with the client and being open to recognize that people are different and giving people the power to define who they are themselves. And I first want to start by saying that I feel like harm reduction has a lot to do with safety. And although we're focusing on harm reduction as related to LGBTQ plus folks, I think that generally speaking, our approach as providers can apply to working with people of various communities as well. When engaging with all clients, we should treat them with compassion and respect, regardless of their gender identity, sexual orientation, race, drug use, choice of work, and so on. And our clients should be able to access services without discrimination. So back to the question, what should staff take into consideration when beginning their work with clients who identify as LGBTQ+. I would take a step back and recognize that we're not always going to know how clients identify, again, as Michelle was saying. And I think that provider bias can show up when we're working with queer folks in our binary worldviews, misgendering a client, meaning not using their correct pronouns, or having assumptions about their sexual orientation. And so to avoid these things, I think we can ask clients what their pronouns are, share ours, ask open-ended questions that prompt more sharing of their stories, and try not to use language that makes any implications regarding their sexual orientation. And when doing this, I think it's okay to have some self-compassion and, realize that we as providers might not always get it right. And I think that's it's okay to mess up. And as long as we're naming it and apologizing to our clients and letting them know that we're really trying, I think that that's part of it as well. Other things to consider when working with this population are sexual health and sex positivity. I think focusing on physical, emotional, mental, and social well-being in relation to sexuality and getting to a place of non-judgment, recognizing that sexuality and sexual activity is okay as long as it's healthy and consensual. If the primary intent of harm reduction is to reduce any harm associated with behavior, then I think that as providers, we can tailor the conversations to clients' needs and focus on their sexual well-being and their relationships if they choose to discuss their sexual activity or even sex work. Again, it's not our place to say what behaviors are good or bad, but it is our responsibility to make sure that clients know the risks associated with behaviors and that they have correct information and access to resources. So I guess overall, as providers, we can be more committed to creating and maintaining safe spaces where clients are able to express who they are without fear of bias and discrimination, and where we can just have honest conversations to address client needs and support them.
Thank you, Christian. I wanted to kind of go back to one of the things that you said about open-ended questions and questions that are non-assuming. Can you guys give me some examples of what some of those questions might look like?
I know that one of the things that I talk about when I'm doing the training is like making sure that you're kind of using gender neutral language when you're working with clients, and it takes practice. I always share that I taught preschool for a really long time before I went back to school to do social work, and I was so used to saying things like mom and dad and go tell your mom and dad what you did at school today, or boys and girls come line up with me. And it took me a long time to shift my language into using things like calling them like friends or classmates or children or whatever, like, or calling them parents or caregivers instead of specifically saying somebody with a mom and dad, because not everybody has a mom and a dad. And not even thinking about LGBTQ plus parents, which there are plenty of, like some people have a mom and a mom. there's a lot of children that only have a mom or a dad, or they were only raised by their grandparents, or maybe their aunties raising them, or maybe they're in foster care. Like, how many of our clients have been through the foster care system at some point, right? So if you're asking questions about their upbringing, if you're asking something like, hey, why don't you tell me about your caregivers? Like, how was that? How were those relationships for you while you were growing up? That's a better question and more open-ended than you saying something like, tell me about your mom and your dad, because you might not get something that you're really trying to get from your client if you're asking them those kinds of questions. Or even like, if they start talking about a partner, and they're talking about this partner, and it's a male client, and you're like, oh, well, how is your girlfriend? Like, well, that's not using gender neutral language, and you're making assumptions. And so that's kind of part of heteronormativity, right? Is we make these assumptions about people that we see on a day-to-day basis. And so kind of removing that from your lens takes time, but like Christian said, have that self-compassion and just be willing to practice with people.
Thank you. Yeah, it sort of piggybacks off what Christian was saying about creating a safe space. And I think by asking those questions in that way is indicating that this is a safe space to talk. Great. Thanks. All right. So our next question is, how do we acknowledge privilege and oppression dynamics when working with clients in the LGBTQ plus community?
I think this one's really important because just even as providers, we already hold a certain amount of privilege, right? No matter how we identify ourselves. So I actually identify as part of the community, and that comes with its own set of, oppression and privilege, right? But I'm also a white person that's part of the community, and I'm also a cisgender person that's part of the community, right? So I have certain privileges that other people may not hold. So I've even had conversations with my clients about that fact, right? That maybe I have clients who are transgender, and I'm not going to understand 100% what they're going through or what kinds of things come through their head when they're having interactions with police, or maybe they're having interactions with housing sites, or, all of the things that come along with being one of our clients. So I think even just acknowledging the privilege that you hold as a provider is one of the first important things to do. And then just realizing that like the community is not like one, like we were saying before, like it's so large and different, right? There's just people of every kind. So you have folks who are different races, you have folks that fall under different umbrellas in the community, you have folks who come from different socioeconomic statuses, and all of those things are going to affect your clients in a different way, right? So if you have clients who have family support, they're going to have a different kind of privilege than folks who maybe were removed from their house at a young age and don't have that family support. So I think really realizing that somebody being part of the community or being queer or whatever they want to identify as is going to affect their day-to-day interactions with people. It's going to affect their interactions, like I said, with the police. Our transgender clients have a really, really hard time generally when they're interacting with the police because of the fact that sometimes their ID doesn't match their gender expression. So someone identifies as a trans woman and maybe their ID says male and they're going to be misgendered, they might be dead named. So there's going to be a lot of maybe triggering things that happen during police interactions, or even trying to get people into shelters. There's a lot of shelters that won't take our transgender clients because they don't fit whatever box they want their clients to fit into. So that can be a very triggering experience as well. So I think just being able to acknowledge that is going to have an impact on the day-to-day things that you do with your client. Christian, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, just to piggyback again a little, I feel like people who are a part of the LGBTQ community are already living, are already being oppressed and living in a society that caters to cisgender and heteronormative values. And at the same time, privilege and oppression also exist on various scales within the LGBTQ spectrum. And like Michelle said, it's important to remember that these various intersectionalities and simultaneous identities play a big part in how people hold privilege and experience oppression in different ways.
And Michelle, you had used the term dead name and I would imagine it's something that our providers would be important for them to know what that means. So would you mind explaining a little bit about that?
Yeah, definitely. So there's a lot of folks that will use this dead naming as a expression for someone who's using their birth name when they don't go by their birth name anymore. So maybe someone who's transgender and has changed their name, and maybe legally they have not had that name change, but socially that's their name, what they go by. They go day-to-day life, that's their name. If you're using their name that is, legal, or their name that they were born into, that's dead naming somebody. And that's another thing that can be super triggering. And when we're thinking of harm reduction as a whole, we're thinking of, like Christian said earlier, safety and reducing the amount of harm that's going to happen to our clients. And I think sometimes as providers, we put a lot of the responsibility on the client, right? Like, what's our client going to do to reduce harm? What kinds of things can our client change to reduce harm? And really, when you're thinking about working with the community, it's what can you do to reduce the harm that you're doing in your interactions? And gendering people properly and using their name is two of the, it sounds really silly, but it's two of the most important things, especially if you're working with transgender clients, is just being able to acknowledge their identity. And it's one of the most important factors, protective factors against depression and depressive symptoms and suicidality when you're working with transgender folks. So yeah, I mean, for some of the clients, we're the only support system they have. Some of our clients don't have emergency contacts, and you're that connection. So in what way are we making that connection feel safe to our clients? And that is one of the more important things. And also just being able to acknowledge if someone does share with you, say one of your clients comes out to you and you didn't know that before, and they come out and they tell you, well, actually, I'm gay, and I wanted you to know because I wanted to talk about my partner. One of the important things is kind of not to diminish what they told you, right? Like, oh, that's okay. Like, I still want to work with you. That's okay. I don't mind. That kind of, one, makes it seem like there is something to be bothered about. And then two, kind of diminishes the fact that they felt safe enough to tell you that. So always just making sure that you're thanking your client for feeling comfortable enough to share that with you, right? I'm so glad that you were able to share that with me in this space. Is there anything that I can do to support you? And then also asking, what other areas are they out in? Because sometimes the client's not going to be out in every single space. Maybe they're going to get a job and they're not going to be out in that space. Or maybe at the doctor's office, they're not out at their doctor's office. So if you're with your client and you're at the doctor's office and you're starting to talk about something that has to do with their sexuality, that's, not going to be very appropriate. So you really have to make sure you're asking the client, like, who knows this as well, and like, how comfortable are you with other people knowing? And because everybody's going to have their own comfort level.
Thank you. That actually kind of segues into our last question, which is what are best practices? So what are some best practices that you guys can share?
I think for starters, again, just creating and maintaining that safe space, asking open-ended questions, and being open, creating a space where a client can share anything, and as a provider, we don't overexcite, like Michelle was saying. We're not shocked by anything they're telling us, and just being open and accepting that and focusing on their needs.
I think also, if we're thinking about resources as a whole that we're connecting our clients to, if you're starting to connect your clients to shelters, right, and you're calling these shelters and you have a client who is transgender, it might not be a good idea for you to just cold call shelters to find out if your client can stay there, because maybe there's going to be 7 shelters that turn your client down before you find the 8th one that's going to accept your client, right? And that could be something that's really dehumanizing for our clients who are transgender. It's like, they can't take me because my body doesn't fit what they think it should fit, right? So I feel like even best practices is ahead of time, when you do have clients who identify as part of the community, knowing what resources might be appropriate to connect them to. So, do you know of certain shelters that don't take transgender clients? don't give those to your client. Don't give them a list of shelters and say, go ahead, here you go, you can call, right? Maybe you have 2 lists. And yeah, it does take a little bit of work off the top, but there are tons of lists online that you can search for. If you get connected to the LGBTQ Center in Long Beach or Los Angeles, they have a ton of resources that they can give you that you can use to support your clients. Also, again, talking about doctors, not every doctor's office is going to be supportive. So really making sure that you have a certain few that you know are going to work with your client and work well with them. And then keeping yourself informed. So even like I shared earlier, even being part of the community doesn't mean that I know every single thing going on within the community, right? So I keep myself informed. Like I want to keep up to date on the language that people are using and like what different things are coming up. And maybe there's a new resource that I wasn't aware of before. So just kind of keeping yourself aware.
It kind of goes back to what you were saying, Michelle. Sometimes we'll put it on the client, like what is the client going to do? But it goes back to what I'm hearing you say is us taking on that responsibility of providing safety by us being informed and up to date and knowing what the resources are. So say we are working with a client, you know, who identifies, then making sure that we have our resources together and we know ahead of time what's up to date. All right. So that has been really helpful. Do you guys have any final comments, anything you'd like to add before we close out?
I think something that I had thought of right now too, I'm thinking of best practices and like resources to connect clients to. I know earlier Christian was talking about like maybe clients who are engaging in sex work or even are just having sex with other people in the community, and maybe like not every resource is going to fit with that as well. So like when you're talking to the client about ways to reduce harm with sexual health, are you referring those clients to centers that are going to be understanding of men who have sex with men or women who have sex with women, or maybe folks who are transgender and are not going to be well served by centers that are focusing on male-female relationships, sexually speaking. And then also thinking about like if we're thinking substance use and we're trying to refer our clients to like needle exchanges, are the staff there going to be welcoming? If you're referring a client to a needle exchange and that client feels unwelcome there, they're not going to use it. So really just like I said earlier, making sure that you're really referring people to the right resources. And when you do have a client who's comfortable talking to you and they identify as part of the community, ask them, like, what kind of resources are you using? Because like I have a couple other clients that might really benefit from these, because once you're in and you know, right? Like you have we have all kinds of clients that have all kinds of hookups to different things, right? So ask your clients, they know where they want to go and where they're comfortable. But I'm on my soapbox. This is my
It's great. It's great. It's great. No, that's super helpful. Christian, did you have anything else to add?
No, I think what Michelle is adding about as providers taking some of the responsibility is, you know, really adding to the conversation of harm reduction. And again, you know, generally speaking, just being a part of this of the community, it's your identity that is the reason for some of these harms. You know, they're associated with identity here, and so being able to just have knowledge, and again, as Michelle said, connecting clients to resources and other services that aren't going to continue this same oppression and discrimination, and really just sort of creating a chain of safe space for them, I think is important. So thank you for sharing that, Michelle.
I also got a bunch of links, Carrie, from someone that that knows like a lot of community resources. And so I'm going to send those over to you so you can link them in the description so folks can check those out.
Excellent. Thank you, Michelle. Well, thank you, Michelle, and thank you, Christian, for being here and sharing this knowledge with us, and we really appreciate you taking the time to be here. So that wraps up our session for today. Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone.
Thank you.